Engage.
Star Trek, the original series, is arguably one of the greatest shows to ever be put on television.
Fascinating.
It is a show that not only captured our imaginations, but also changed the very fabric of television and our culture. From its rocky beginnings to its triumphant legacy, join me as we discuss the untold stories that brought this groundbreaking series to life. Our story begins with a man named Gene Roddenberry. Eugene Wesley Roddenberry was born on August 19, 1921 in El Paso, Texas, but his parents moved to Los Angeles when Gene was only 2 years old. As a child, Gene Roddenberry had asthma and he was very sickly and was bedridden a lot. He escaped through reading and idolizing science fiction pulp heroes, and he was a huge fan of John Carter of Mars, Tarzan, and the Skylark space series, and these stories would shape him as an adult. As he becomes a young teenager, he dreams of one day becoming a science fiction writer. After graduating high school, he majored in police science at Los Angeles City College, and then in 1942, he commissioned into the U.S. Army and served as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force as a bomber pilot. He flew on over 80 combat missions during World War II. In 1945, he got a job working as a pilot for Pan Am World Airways. However, on a flight where he was not flying and he was on the plane as a passenger, the airplane crashed. In 1948, he resigned from Pan Am, and in 1949, he joined the Los Angeles Police Department. He worked in traffic and then joined the LAPD newspaper unit, where he became the speechwriter for the chief of police. And in this position as the writer for the LAPD, he became the liaison for the television show Dragnet, providing technical consultation for episodes of the show. And he even helped write a few episodes of Dragnet, and this convinced him that he might be successful as a writer in Hollywood. He quit the LAPD and began writing TV shows. And he wrote for several shows, but the show that had the most profound influence on him was a show called Have Gun, Will Travel, where he won the Writers Guild of America Award for Best Teleplay in 1958. Have Gun, Will Travel was a Western television series that ran for 6 seasons about a cowboy named Paladin, played by Richard Boone, who traveled around the Old West as a gun for hire. And this show was known for its sympathetic and progressive portrayal of American Indians that wildly differed from other Westerns at the time. The character of Paladin was an interesting and complex man that had a wild, swashbuckling heroic side, a thoughtful, introverted, intellectual side, and a passionate, emotional, humanistic side, and often these 3 sides would conflict with each other inside Paladin. And Gene Roddenberry liked this idea of 3 sides of a personality in conflict, and when he created Star Trek Season 1, he was thinking of these 3 sides of Paladin and broke them up into 3 different people. The swashbuckling heroic side became James T. Kirk, the thoughtful, philosophical, intellectual side became Spock, and the passionate, humanistic side became Dr. Leonard McCoy. Roddenberry's first show that he successfully created was for NBC called The Lieutenant, and it was an ensemble drama about the lives of Marine officers. The main character was Second Lieutenant William Tiberius Rice, a young graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy who is assigned his first command of a rifle platoon. Lieutenant Rice was played by Gary Lockwood, who would go on to play Gary Mitchell in the pilot episode Where No Man Has Gone Before. The show had the support of the Pentagon, which allowed the production team to borrow military equipment such as uniforms and tanks, and was even allowed to film on military installations. The Pentagon support was crucial for the filming of the show. Many actors from the show would go on to be cast in Star Trek, including Leonard Nimoy, Majel Barrett, Nichelle Nichols, and Walter Koenig. Even Ricardo Montalban, who would later star as Khan in Star Trek, starred in an episode of The Lieutenant. In episode 21 of that sole 1 season, there was an episode called Set It Right, written by Lee Irvin. Don Marshall played Private Ernest Cameron, who has conflicts with Corporal Peter Devlin, played by a young Dennis Hopper. The main character, Lieutenant Rice, would help settle their disputes and force them to work together. And future Uhura actress Nichelle Nichols played Private Cameron's wife. This episode featured a complex and nuanced depiction of the diverse cast and notably portrayed the marriage of the black couple as loving and supportive. The episode explored themes of racism and was frank in discussing the difficulties that a black man has in navigating the racist world of 1960s America. And such discussions were unheard of at the time. So unheard of that most TV broadcasters refused to air it. However, Gene Roddenberry went to the NAACP and had them pressure the networks to air the show, which they did, although in limited markets. However, the Pentagon objected to the portrayal of the U.S. military as being a racist place and withdrew their support of the show. And without the Pentagon's support, the show was canceled after the first season. So Gene Roddenberry began to work on his second television show. He decided to place the series not on a modern ship, but on a spaceship traveling in space exploring other planets. And he called it Star Trek. Being a science fiction fantasy show had certain advantages in that he could discuss heavy topics of the time like love, God, war, nature, all these things that make up the excitement of the human condition, but he would get away with it because the setting would seem so make-believe. For the captain of the ship, he was inspired by the swashbuckling hero, Horatio Hornblower, and he would name his swashbuckling starship captain Robert April. He finished his draft on March 11, 1964, and in April he registered Star Trek with the Motion Picture Writers Guild, and he had a 16-page treatment that he began to show the networks. Roddenberry went to the three networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, and they all passed. He then landed a meeting at Desilu, a studio owned by Lucille Ball, and he pitched this show as Wagon Train to the Stars, and Wagon Train was a very popular Western at the time. So Roddenberry was pitching an action-packed Western that took place in outer space, and the executives at Desilu loved it. Phasers instead of pistols, spaceships instead of horses. And once Desilu signed on to produce Star Trek, NBC, who was desperate to work with Lucille Ball, signed on to back Star Trek. Lucille Ball funded the pilot episode of Star Trek out of her developmental fund, so Lucille Ball put up $300,000 of her own money, and NBC matched and put up the other $300,000. And they gave Gene Roddenberry $600,000 to produce the pilot episode. This was worth $6 million in today's money, when Star Trek was funded. Now, the executives did not like the name of the starship captain, Captain Robert April, and so Gene Roddenberry changed it to Robert Winter. But the NBC executives liked the name Christopher Pike, and so the protagonist of Star Trek became Captain Christopher Pike. While developing Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry leaned into the military. The uniforms of Starfleet, the quarters of the Enterprise had sounds and whistles that were all taken from the military. This was because in 1965, it was only 20 years after World War II, where almost half of the adult males had served. It would have been very recognizable and appealing to the adult male demographic. And for the role of Christopher Pike, Gene Roddenberry's first choice was William Shatner. However, William Shatner was starring in his own TV show for CBS called We the People, and therefore he was not available for the role. And so the production considered a whole bunch of male actors, including James Coburn, George Segal, Patrick O'Neill, Peter Graves, Rod Taylor, just to name a few, but most of them passed or demanded too much money. Down the list was an actor named Jeffrey Hunter. They then hired Jeffrey Hunter, who was an up-and-coming actor who was slowly transitioning into becoming a leading man. He had starred opposite John Wayne in the 1956 classic western, The Searchers, and in 1961, he starred in the role of Jesus Christ in the high-budget epic, The King of Kings. He was on the verge of superstardom. However, the production team worried that he was a little too stiff and wooden and worried that he was too handsome, which audiences might have found unrelatable. However, he was a marquee name, and so Jeffrey Hunter was signed on as Captain Christopher Pike. In 1964, Jeffrey Hunter accepted the lead in the Star Trek pilot originally called The Menagerie, but this was changed to The Cage. However, footage of The Cage was reused in Star Trek Season 1 for a two-part episode titled The Menagerie. For the role of First Officer, Gene Roddenberry shocked the industry by having her be a woman. This was revolutionary at the time, and many people could not believe that he was even considering this. In 1965, the idea of a second-in-command being a woman was very ahead of its time. But for the role of First Officer, he chose Majel Barrett. For the role of the ship's doctor, Gene Roddenberry wanted DeForest Kelley. However, at this time, DeForest Kelley was primarily known as an actor who starred in westerns as the villain. Therefore, the studios could not imagine him as a protagonist lead, much less a doctor, and they vetoed his casting. So the role went to veteran character actor John Hoyt. Desilu Studios began filming the first episode of Star Trek titled The Cage on November 27, 1964, and the episode was incredibly imaginative and had amazing special effects. It was the first TV show to use blue screen when showing the Enterprise zipping across space. And because it would have been too expensive to have a ship land on the planet, they came up with a creative solution to save money, the transporter. And they created this effect by shooting glitter through a tube and lighting it, and then fading out the transporting actor, and then a second later, fading out the glitter. It was quite simple to do, but it looked very good, and the NBC executives were very impressed with this effect. The transporter would become a Star Trek icon. For Science Officer, Gene Roddenberry had written a part specifically for Leonard Nimoy, who played an intelligent and contemplative character on an episode of Gene Roddenberry's first show, The Lieutenant. And this character would be an alien, originally envisioned as a red alien with pointy ears and a sharp tail like a devil, who would eat energy rods through his stomach. However, this was eventually changed to a normal-looking alien with simply sharp, pointy ears. Leonard Nimoy was born in Boston, Massachusetts, to Jewish immigrant parents who escaped out of 𝐬𝐮𝐫𝐽, Ukraine by sneaking into Poland and was smuggled out of the Soviet Union by hiding in bales of hay. As a child, Leonard Nimoy did odd jobs to help his parents make ends meet, and he sold newspapers, shined shoes, set up chairs in movie theaters, and when he got older, sold vacuum cleaners. Leonard Nimoy began singing at his synagogue and then got a job voice acting Bible stories on the radio. He then moved to Los Angeles to break into acting and drove a taxi and stocked vending machines to make ends meet. And then in 1953, enlisted in the U.S. Army Reserves and worked in the Army putting on stage shows for the troops. Nimoy quickly became successful as a prominent character actor and nabbed roles in The Twilight Zone and appeared 4 times on Wagon Train. He also appeared in Perry Mason, The Untouchables, The Virginian with future co-star DeForest Kelley, and Get Smart among his many roles. And he even worked with William Shatner on an episode of The Man from U.N.C.L.E. Gene Roddenberry had Leonard Nimoy in mind when he created Spock. However, the character of Spock was completely different from the Spock we know today, and this was because Nimoy, who was an experienced stage actor, wanted to play against his lead to contrast the two characters. And since Jeffrey Hunter was playing the cool and calm and thoughtful Christopher Pike, Leonard Nimoy played his Spock to be more energetic and emotional. In that episode of The Cage, you see him smile quite often. The pilot was titled The Cage, and Captain Pike and the Enterprise answer a distress call on the 4th planet of Talos. And on the planet, they find Vina, one of the survivors of the crashed vessel. But Pike is captured by the 𝐾𝐿ogians, a group of powerful aliens with telepathic abilities, and they intend to have Pike and Vina breed to create a slave race to help reclaim their ravaged planet. Ultimately, Number 1 is able to rescue Pike from the 𝐾𝐿ogians, but when they try to escape with Vina, they discover that Vina only has the life she has due to the psychic powers of the 𝐾𝐿ogians, and she decides to stay behind to live in a state of illusory bliss.
He has an illusion, and you have reality. May you find your way as pleasant.
It's a deep, thought-provoking, and emotionally resonant story worthy of the Star Trek series. However, when Gene Roddenberry premiered The Cage to NBC, they were not happy with what they got. The NBC executives were not happy with Spock's pointy ears. They were concerned that television viewers in the Bible Belt would think that Spock's ears were depicting Satan and feared that the entire South would refuse to watch the show. And most importantly, they were upset with the episode of The Cage. They were promised an action-packed western in outer space, and they imagined gunfights with lasers and epic space battles. What they got was a slow, thoughtful, very cerebral show with minimal action and lots of exposition. And the NBC executives knew there was no way they can sell this to advertisers. So they passed on the pilot. But then something unheard of happened. And it was unheard of in 1964, and it's still unheard of today. But Gene Roddenberry got a second chance with a second pilot. This is because Lucille Ball, who had to endure intense levels of sexism in the male-dominated business world, was fascinated with Gene's vision of the future, where a woman was second in command of a Federation starship. She liked this vision of the future and wanted it on the small screen. And she agreed to pay for a second pilot and gave another $300,000 of her own money. And NBC, who wanted to work with Lucille Ball, agreed to put up the other half one more time. So Gene Roddenberry was given another $600,000 and a valuable second chance. But they warned him this one had better be more action-packed or else. But they also had another demand. They basically said either the woman goes or the guy with the ears goes. And it appears NBC was willing to put up with one controversy, but not two. Gene Roddenberry ultimately chose to keep Leonard Nimoy's Spock and ditch Number 1, played by Majel Barrett. And he would later recast Majel Barrett as the ship's nurse, Christine Chapel. There's those that believe that there may have been another reason for Majel Barrett's firing. Gene Roddenberry and Majel Barrett were having an affair. Gene Roddenberry was married at this time and had 2 daughters, but began an extramarital affair with Majel Barrett. And this was well known in Hollywood, and some believe this may have contributed to the demand for her to leave the show. Incidentally, the two would marry in 1969, and they would have 1 son and would stay happily married until Gene Roddenberry would pass away with her by his bedside in 1991. When Roddenberry began casting for the second pilot, he went with people he had worked with on his last show, The Lieutenant. He cast Nichelle Nichols as the ship's communications officer, and if they wouldn't let a woman as second in command, he was going to hire an African-American woman as another officer on the bridge. Nichelle Nichols was born in Chicago, Illinois, to a factory worker who was elected to the town mayor of Robbins in Chicago, as well as the town magistrate. She graduated high school and attended the Chicago Ballet Academy. She then toured the country as a singer and dancer with Duke Ellington, and then worked as a singer, dancer, and model, and even worked as a singer for Hugh Hefner's Playboy Club. She then began to work in theater, where she earned high critical praise. Her big break came in 1964 when she starred in an episode of Gene Roddenberry's show, The Lieutenant, but the show only aired in limited markets due to the controversial discussion of racism. Gene Roddenberry remembered her phenomenal portrayal in The Lieutenant and hired her as Lieutenant Uhura, the communications officer in Star Trek. And she was one of the first black women to star in a major television series, which was unprecedented at the time. He then cast Asian American actor 𝐷𝐸 as Hikaru Sulu as the ship's navigating officer. 𝐷𝐸 was born in Los Angeles, California, to a third-generation Japanese-American mother and a Japanese immigrant father who became a successful real estate broker. But then came World War II, when 𝐷𝐸 was 5 years old, he and his family were interned at a Japanese internment camp in Rower, Arkansas. Upon being released from the internment camp, his family had all their property, all their bank accounts, and all their assets seized by the government, and the family returned to Los Angeles and lived in a homeless shelter for 5 years. George studied hard in school and became the president of his high school board, and he was accepted to the University of California, Berkeley, but transferred to UCLA, where he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Theater and went on to get his Master's in Theater. He then joined the Shakespeare Institute and then joined the Desilu Acting Workshop. He quickly began to receive many roles as a character actor in Hollywood, in TV, and in movies, and in 1964 appeared on an episode of The Twilight Zone and then on an episode of Mission Impossible. In 1965, he was hired on the second pilot of Star Trek as an astrophysicist, but this role was eventually changed to a helmsman in the first season of the series. Then the ship's doctor, John Hoyt, decided to leave the project in order to do movies, and Gene Roddenberry knew exactly who he wanted. His original first choice, DeForest Kelley. DeForest Kelley was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and his father was a Baptist minister, where DeForest Kelley began singing in the church choir. DeForest originally wanted to go to medical school to become a doctor, but his parents could not afford to send him. So DeForest made extra money by singing on the radio, and after graduating college, starred in some movies as a chorus singer. During World War II, he served in the U.S. Army Air Force and afterwards moved to California to pursue acting. And one of his first roles was playing a ranch owner in the 1949 episode of The Lone Ranger, and then starred as Morgan Earp in the gunfight at the OK Corral opposite Burt Lancaster's Wyatt Earp. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, he was a successful character actor playing bit parts in TV and movies, and in 1966, he appeared in a TV pilot created by Gene Roddenberry called 333 Montgomery that was not picked up. Then in 1967, he starred in Gene Roddenberry's pilot called Police Story, but that was also not picked up. And after John Hoyt left, Gene Roddenberry offered DeForest Kelley the role of Dr. McCoy. However, the NBC executives still saw him as an actor that played villains, so Gene Roddenberry was strategic. He had DeForest Kelley cut his hair to look like a good guy and hoped that this would subliminally make the executives think good guy. And so he had DeForest Kelley get his haircut resembling JFK. And it worked. DeForest Kelley was approved as the new ship's doctor. Rounding out the cast was James Doohan as the ship's engineer, Montgomery Scott. James Doohan was born in Vancouver, British Columbia, and his parents were Irish immigrants. His father was a dentist and pharmacist, and James Doohan excelled in mathematics and science and enlisted in the Canadian Army Cadet Corps. He then enlisted in the Royal Canadian Artillery and saw combat, landing in the second wave of D-Day during World War II, where he saw extensive combat and was hit 6 times. His right middle finger was shot off during combat, so he always had a missing finger during his acting career. During World War II, he was hit square in the chest and would have died, but the bullet was stopped by a cigarette case his brother had given him. After the war, he moved to Ontario, where he worked in radio. He then became a prominent character actor in Hollywood, on TV and movies, and appeared in The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limit, The Fugitive, and The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And he was also known as being very adept at foreign accents. And Gene Roddenberry hired him in Star Trek and wanted him to do a foreign accent, most likely a British accent, but it was James Doohan who said that the best engineers in the world are from Scotland and suggested a Scottish accent. And thus, Montgomery Scott was born. Jeffrey Hunter, who had played Captain Christopher Pike, declined to return, choosing to pursue a movie career. For the ship's captain, the NBC executives got lucky. The show We the People had finished up, and William Shatner, who had been Roddenberry's first choice for Captain Christopher Pike, was now available, and he was hired as the new Captain James Kirk. William Shatner was born in Montreal, Canada, to a conservative Jewish family, and his grandparents immigrated from Ukraine and Lithuania when it was part of the Austro-Hungary Empire. William Shatner attended McGill University and studied economics, and he graduated with a Bachelor of Commerce. However, while in college, he landed a small role in a movie called The Butler's Night Off and was bitten by the acting bug. After graduating college, he joined the Mountain Playhouse in Montreal, the Canadian National Repertory Theatre in Ottawa, and the Stratford Shakespearean Festival. And in 1954, he left Canada and moved to New York City to pursue a career in acting. He then landed a few bit parts as a character actor, but then landed 2 classic episodes of The Twilight Zone, including the iconic Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, and he would become a prominent character actor in Hollywood. However, in 1965, when he was Roddenberry's first choice to be in the Star Trek pilot, he was already committed to the court drama We the People, but the show was canceled after 13 episodes, which freed him up just in time as the second pilot was casting. In the second pilot, titled Where No Man Has Gone Before, the Enterprise encounters a strange barrier that damages the ship's warp drive and kills 9 crew members. Helmsman Lieutenant Commander Gary Mitchell, played by Gary Lockwood of The Lieutenant, and the ship's psychiatrist, Dr. Elizabeth Demmer, both survive, but Mitchell develops silvery eyes and psychic powers. Once a close friend of Captain Kirk, Gary Mitchell becomes more and more arrogant, thinking of himself as a god, and he eventually enforces his will on the ship and threatens the entire crew of the Enterprise. Spock advises Kirk to kill him before he gets too powerful, but Kirk decides to maroon him on a planet, and this leads to a battle between Kirk and Mitchell on the planet's surface. This episode is fantastic. It has the deep philosophical and thought-provoking exploration of themes that Star Trek is known for, but also has action and fun in order to please the NBC executives, and most importantly, the advertisers. Everyone was happy and Star Trek was picked up and approved for 1 season. However, each episode was projected to cost $185,000 per episode, and NBC only gave Roddenberry a budget of $100,000. Lucille Ball stepped in and gave Gene Roddenberry the additional $85,000 out of Desilu's own budget. And this saves Star Trek for now, but this would come to haunt Lucille Ball and Desilu for the next few years. Gene Roddenberry also hired another Gene, 𝐮𝐿, as the head writer and showrunner. And it is 𝐮𝐿 who is responsible for some of the best stories of Star Trek. During the first season, Roddenberry also promoted his production secretary, Dorothy Fontana, also known as DC Fontana, to one of the show's writers. She would write 2 scripts for season 1 and fix the script for the episode This Side of Paradise. Gene Roddenberry hired her as story editor, making her one of the few female story editors in Hollywood and the youngest story editor working at the time. She also rewrote Harlan Ellison's script City on the Edge of Forever into what we saw on the small screen, but we'll get to that in a moment. Prior to the airing of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry took his pilot, Where No Man Had Gone Before, to the 24th World Science Fiction Convention on September 1966 and showed it to a crowd of over 850 science fiction fans. He was nervous, but he received thunderous applause. And that's when he realized he had something special. The next day at the convention, he aired the rejected pilot The Cage, and it too received thunderous applause. Gene Roddenberry knew that whatever happened with the networks, he had found a core audience. Season 1, Episode 1, The Man Trap, premiered that night on September 8, 1966 in the Thursday 8:30 p.m. time slot. Interestingly, The Man Trap was not the first intended episode of Star Trek. It was the 4th episode of the season filmed and the 6th episode if you count the 2 pilots. However, NBC demanded that the first episode of Star Trek have a monster in it. Their logic was that people love and understand monsters, and since The Man Trap was the first episode to have a monster, it aired first. And the ratings were sensational. The entire first season is fantastic, consisting of 29 episodes. Almost every single one of them are slam dunks, and it set a benchmark for network television. I can't go over every single episode of season 1, but I will eventually go over my top 10 episodes. But for now, I'll briefly go over the episodes that I think are the most significant. In episode 5, The Enemy Within, a transporter accident splits Captain Kirk into an evil half and a good half, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Mr. Spock was to hit the evil Captain Kirk on the head with a phaser to subdue him. However, Leonard Nimoy thought that it was out of character for his dignified Spock to clunk someone on the head and went to director Leo Penn, incidentally, Sean Penn's father, and suggested a Vulcan nerve pinch. Nimoy told Leo that Vulcans understand the electromagnetic nervous system of humans and could use this knowledge to calmly incapacitate their foes. William Shatner demonstrated with a pain reaction, and in that moment, the Vulcan nerve pinch was born. Leo Penn was so stunned by this that he used it in the shot. In episode 11 and 12, The Menagerie, the team reused old footage of the failed first pilot The Cage and created these 2 episodes. Episode 14, Balance of Terror, introduces the Romulans. The Enterprise faces a Romulan ship that has been attacking outposts along the neutral zone. The episode culminates in a tense showdown between Kirk and the Romulan commander. And this episode is beloved for its exploration of the themes of war and prejudice, reflecting Cold War tensions of the era. The cat and mouse dynamic between Kirk and the Romulan commander provides a compelling psychological depth. Mark Leonard, who will become better known as Spock's father Sarek, plays the Romulan commander. It's an outstanding episode that matches wits between two ship captains. It also introduces the idea that Star Trek space battles will resemble naval submarine battles, and this idea will heavily inspire the space battles in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Episode 17, The Swire of Gothos, where the Enterprise crew are captured by a godlike being named Trelane, who plays with the crew. But in a shocking but satisfying ending reminiscent of a Twilight Zone episode, Trelane turns out to be an infant child of a powerful race whose playtime has simply gotten out of hand. In Episode 18, Arena, features another godlike race, the Metrons, who pit Kirk to face off against a Gorn in a desert-like planet, and Kirk is physically outmatched, but uses his ingenuity to defeat the powerful Gorn. In Episode 22, Space Seed introduces a young, genetically enhanced 𝐿 who tries to take over the Enterprise, but is brought down by Kirk, who maroons him on the planet Ceti Alpha 5, and this episode will be continued in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Episode 26, Errand of Mercy, we meet the Klingons for the first time, who will become a main staple in the Star Trek franchise, and in Star Trek fandom. And in Episode 28, The City on the Edge of Forever, generally regarded as one of the best, if not the best, Star Trek episode ever. Captain Kirk and Spock go through the Guardian of Forever in search of Dr. McCoy and travel back in time to Depression-era Earth, where Kirk rescues and falls in love with Edith Keeler, played by Joan Collins. They learn that the act of saving this woman's life will prevent the creation of the Federation. Edith Keeler will become an advocate of peace, prevent the US from entering World War II, Hitler will take over the world, and Earth never develops space travel, and the Federation is never born. Kirk has to tragically allow the love of his life to die in order to preserve the future. And this episode is heart-wrenching while exploring themes of peace and war and love and sacrifice. This is the best of Star Trek. It was written by science fiction legend Harlan Ellison, who actually wrote it as a non-Star Trek story, but then retrofitted it into Star Trek. In his original story, a drug addict named Beckwith escapes the Enterprise through a time portal and lands in Prohibition-era Earth and changes the future. Unfortunately, Harlan Ellison's script, while brilliant, was unfilmable and would have cost millions to make. DC Fontana came in and fixed Harlan Ellison's script. For one, she replaced the drug addict character Beckwith with Leonard McCoy, who accidentally injects himself with a medication and becomes deranged, and Kirk and Spock go through the portal to find Dr. McCoy. And at the end of the story, Gene Roddenberry added a speech by Edith Keeler that left audiences with a sense of hope. Harlan Ellison was furious about the rewrites and tried to take his name off the project. However, they needed Harlan Ellison's name on the story to give the episode legitimacy, so Roddenberry threatened to drive Ellison out of Hollywood if he didn't allow Star Trek to put his name on the episode, and Harlan Ellison finally agreed. The episode ended up costing Desilu $245,000 and was the most expensive episode of Star Trek. And then the episode came out and it was a huge success. It was nominated for multiple awards, and because Ellison's name was on the script, he won full rights to the episode. He won the Writers Guild Award for Best Dramatic Hour-Long Script in 1966, and in 1967 won a Hugo Award. While the critical reception and ratings of the show were somewhat lukewarm, the show developed a loyal and rabid fan base. The show began to receive thousands of fan mail every week, and Leonard Nimoy received the most, followed by William Shatner. All the cast received lots of fan mail except one. Oddly, Nichelle Nichols received no fan mail, but she later discovered that she had received tons of fan mail, but the NBC executives were withholding her fan mail for some unknown reason. And many, including Nichelle Nichols, speculates that it may have had something to do with racism. Toward the end of season 1, Uhuru actress Nichelle Nichols was considering leaving the show. She had felt underutilized in the show, and she was getting offers to star in several Broadway musicals. She handed in her letter of resignation to Gene Roddenberry, who gave her the weekend to think about it. And as if by divine providence, that weekend, she met Martin Luther King Jr. At an NAACP fundraiser, Nichelle Nichols was signing autographs, and she was told there was a fan who wanted to meet her. And she immediately bumped into Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and thought, well, my fan will have to wait. I have to meet my leader, Reverend Martin Luther King. Then Reverend Martin Luther King said, Miss Nichols, I am your biggest fan. Star Trek is our favorite TV show, and it's the only show where we allow our children to stay up past their bedtime to watch it. And she told him that she was going to miss her cast and that she was leaving Star Trek. And Reverend King said, no, you cannot. Don't you understand what this man, Gene Roddenberry, has achieved? For the first time on television, we will be seen as we should be seen every single day, as intelligent, as quality, beautiful people who can sing and dance, but also people who can go into space, who can be lawyers and teachers, who are professors. How it is in real life, but you don't see it on television until now. Gene Roddenberry has opened the door for people to see us. You cannot leave. Nichelle Nichols was blown away by this, and she realized that he was speaking the truth. And that Monday, she went to Gene and she tore up her letter of resignation. Now, despite lukewarm viewership ratings, Star Trek had one thing on its side. While overall Nielsen viewership was not very high, Star Trek was very popular with the 18 to 35-year-old demographic, and this was the prime demographic that tends to purchase goods and is therefore most popular with advertisers. Therefore, Star Trek had a leg up when it came to the network selling commercials. Also, Star Trek tended to be popular with college graduates, professors, and professionals like teachers, lawyers, and doctors, and this also helped selling commercials to advertisers. Fearing cancellation of the show, Gene Roddenberry helped organize a massive letter-writing campaign by the fans, and NBC received hundreds of thousands of letters, and several fans even picketed NBC. This helped Star Trek get renewed for a second season. However, the budget for each episode had to be reduced, and during season 2, they added a new character. NBC wanted a young character in order to appeal to a younger demographic. Walter Koenig, who had a passing resemblance to actor Davy Jones of the Monkees, was hired as the navigator. And in 1967, the TV show The Monkees was the only show on NBC that was getting more fan mail than Star Trek, and they wanted a little piece of that monkey demographic. They even styled his hair to look like Davy Jones. Walter Koenig was born in Chicago, Illinois to Russian Jewish parents who immigrated from Lithuania. He initially went to Grinnell College where he majored in pre-med, but transferred to UCLA where he received a bachelor in psychology. He then moved to New York where he joined the Neighborhood Playhouse School of the Theater, where he worked with his fellow actors James Doohan and future Commander Krug, Christopher Lloyd. And one of his first TV jobs was a small role on Gene Roddenberry's show, The Lieutenant. He was hired in season 2 as Pavel Chekhov. However, they made one change. Originally, he was to be Englishman, but since the Russians were beating the US in the space race, Roddenberry felt it wasn't right to exclude the Russians from a future involving space exploration. Furthermore, it was 1967, the height of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, and the Russians were our enemies. And Gene Roddenberry wanted to make a statement about the future, that in the future, there are no countries at war on Earth, and there was only one federation. The premiere episode of season 2 is Amok Time. Spock begins to have psychological symptoms and begins to become very violent.
Brian, if I want anything from you, I'll ask for it. Captain.
The crew discover that Spock is going through Ponfar, a season of mating which occurs every 7 years on Vulcan, and if Spock does not mate, he could die. Kirk disobeys a direct order from Starfleet and chooses to help his friend by getting him to Vulcan. When Kirk and the crew travel with him, they are drawn into a duel between Spock and his betrothed T'Pring. And this is also where Vulcan lore was significantly expanded in the canon. In addition to Ponfar, we visit the planet Vulcan for the first time. We get the introduction of the Vulcan salute. Nimoy saw this gesture during a blessing at the synagogue where the Kohanim, or priests, would extend their palms over the congregation with their thumbs outstretched and their middle and ring fingers parted. This gesture corresponds to the Hebrew letter Shin, which stands for El Shaddai, meaning Almighty God. The episode is also the first time we hear the Vulcan phrase,
"Live long and prosper."
In season 2, episode 4, Mirror Mirror, features the Mirror Universe, which will become a Star Trek franchise trope. A transporter malfunctions and sends Kirk, McCoy, Scotty, and Uhura into a parallel universe where the Federation is an evil empire. They must navigate this brutal reality while trying to return to their own universe. The episode is beloved for its clever exploration of the duality and nature of good versus evil. The concept of the Mirror Universe became a hallmark of the franchise, inspiring numerous stories in later series. Episode 6 features the Doomsday Machine. The Doomsday Machine is a pivotal episode from Star Trek the original series that follows the USS Enterprise as it investigates a massive planet-destroying machine that has devastated the USS Constellation and its crew. Captain Matt Decker, the lone survivor, becomes obsessed with defeating the machines. As the Enterprise races against time to protect a nearby planet, Kirk and his crew devise a daring plan to lure the Doomsday Machine away, culminating in a dramatic showdown where Decker sacrifices himself to ensure the threat is neutralized. And this gives Kirk an idea of how he might destroy the Doomsday Machine. Decker's descent into madness highlights the dangers of allowing grief to cloud judgment, while the machine serves as a metaphor for the impersonal and catastrophic nature of the destructive forces in the universe. And if the name Matt Decker sounds familiar, Gene Roddenberry confirmed that he is indeed the father of Star Trek The Motion Picture's commander, William Decker. In episode 10, Journey to Babel, we meet Spock's parents, his mother, the Earthwoman named Amanda, played by Jane Wyatt, and his father, Sarek, played by Mark Leonard. In this episode, we also meet two new species who will become Star Trek staples, the Andorians and the Tellurites. In Season 2, Episode 15, The Trouble with Tribbles, features the Star Trek universe's cutest and most annoying species, the Tribbles. The Enterprise is sent to Deep Space Station K7, where they encounter an infestation of adorable, rapidly reproducing creatures known as Tribbles. As the Tribbles multiply, they create havoc aboard the ship and leads to comedic situations, and the episode culminates in a confrontation with Klingons who are less amused by the Tribbles' chaos. The Tribbles became an iconic symbol of the franchise, and the episode cleverly blends comedy with social commentary about bureaucracy and conflict. It's a fan favorite that continues to entertain audiences across generations. And this episode was also featured in Season 5, Episode 6 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Trials and Tribulations, which aired on November 4th, 1996. And in that episode, the crew of Deep Space Nine go back in time and interact with the crew of the USS Enterprise of this very episode. Episode 18, A Piece of the Action, is one of my favorite episodes that features a planet who has modeled itself on the Prohibition era of Earth. All inhabitants are modeled after Chicago gangsters wearing pinstripe suits and carrying Tommy guns. And this episode is worth it just to see William Shatner dressed like a Prohibition gangster, speaking in an over-the-top mobster accent.
All right, Scotty, we made a deal with 𝐸𝐿.
This episode also features a very comedic tone and lighthearted theme, and the truth is that a lot of the Star Trek episodes were genuinely funny, a concept that'll be carried over and homaged in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. By the end of the second season, there was a problem. Gene Roddenberry encouraged fans to begin a letter-writing campaign asking NBC to renew Star Trek for a third season, and NBC received over 1 million letters from the fans. However, there was an even bigger problem, and that was money. Star Trek was incredibly expensive to produce, and at this time, 𝐤𝐵𝐿𝐼 was producing 3 popular TV shows, Star Trek for NBC, and Mission Impossible and Mannix for CBS. Star Trek and Mission Impossible were 2 of the most expensive TV shows on television, and 𝐤𝐵𝐿𝐼 was bleeding money. So it turned out that Star Trek really did break 𝐤𝐵𝐿𝐼 after all, and 𝐤𝐵𝐿𝐼 was in danger of going under. However, in 1967, Paramount Pictures, who was at this time a motion picture company, was wanting to break into this fairly new medium of television, and they shopped around for a TV studio, and lo and behold, right next door to Paramount, literally, physically, next door to Paramount Studios, was 𝐤𝐵𝐿𝐼 Studios, and they were in financial trouble. They made 𝐤𝐵𝐿𝐼 an offer. So Lucille Ball sold 𝐤𝐵𝐿𝐼 to Paramount for a generous sum of money, and now Paramount owned 𝐤𝐵𝐿𝐼 and Star Trek. And Paramount immediately slashed the budget of Star Trek for Season 3. Furthermore, Gene Roddenberry began to have personality clashes with his head writer and showrunner, 𝐸𝐮_𝐞𝐭, who had single-handedly been responsible for the brilliance of the first 2 seasons. 𝐸𝐮_𝐞𝐭 left Star Trek. However, Gene Roddenberry wanted to do something special, something big for Season 3. And for the 10th episode of Season 3, Plato's Stepchildren, he had Uhura and Kirk share a kiss, albeit one forced under psychokinesis. This will be the first kiss between a Caucasian and an African American to be aired on television. Network executives were nervous, but Roddenberry felt that the time was right. Fortunately for everyone, the head of NBC was a huge fan of Uhura and Nichelle Nichols and completely supported her. The crew and NBC were still concerned about the public backlash, but to everyone's surprise, after the show aired, the general public was accepting of it. There was no complaints, and the episode received tons of praise, and almost no one found the kiss offensive. The only famous negative comment was from a fan who said it was unbelievable that Kirk would try to fight the kiss. In the complaint, he said, if a red-blooded American like Kirk gets a beautiful dame in his arms that looks like Uhura, he ain't gonna fight it. However, there was one problem for Star Trek. NBC had promised to move Star Trek to a better time slot on Monday at 7:30. After that slot was freed when Man from U.N.C.L.E. completed its run. However, the comedy show Laugh-In was getting very good ratings at that time, so Star Trek was moved to Fridays at 10 p.m. This was a terrible slot and was often called the slot of death since most young people tend to go out on dates on Friday night or go out with friends during this time. Roddenberry was so disgusted with this choice that he essentially quit the show. So Season 3 began with a terrible time slot on Friday at 10 p.m., massive cuts to the budget, the showrunner 𝐸𝐮_𝐞𝐭, who was responsible for Season 1 and 2, who had just left the show, and now the creator Gene Roddenberry had essentially stopped working on Star Trek. Contrary to popular belief, Roddenberry was not fired, nor did he officially quit. He just significantly decreased the time he spent working on the show. Instead, he was busy working on a new movie based on Isaac Asimov's I, Robot and a movie about Tarzan. And Star Trek 3 didn't have a chance. Expectedly, the ratings cratered, and Star Trek was indeed canceled after Season 3 on February 1969, with only 79 episodes. And it was no surprise that there was a sharp decrease in quality in Season 3. When fans and critics make a list of the best Star Trek the Original Series episode, Season 3 generally has the fewest episodes, while a list of the worst episodes will invariably be overrepresented by Season 3. The premiere episode of Season 3, Episode 1, was titled Spock's Brain, and this episode is so bad that it has become a meme unto itself. However, there are some good episodes. Season 3, Episode 2, The Enterprise Incident, written by D.C. Fontana, is fantastic and regarded as one of the best episodes of Star Trek. In the Enterprise Incident, the USS Enterprise is on a mission near the Romulan neutral zone when Captain Kirk and his crew execute a daring plan to steal a Romulan cloaking device. And to facilitate this, Kirk feigns insanity, allowing himself to be captured by the Romulans. Once aboard their ship, he is aided by his trusted officer Spock, who plays along with the ruse. And this episode features a tense cat-and-mouse game between Kirk and the Romulan commander, showcasing the complexities of espionage and the lengths to which Starfleet will go to gain an advantage over its enemies. One of my favorite episodes is Season 3, Episode 6, Spectre of the Gun, written by 𝐬𝐮𝐿. The Enterprise encounters a race of telepaths known as the 𝐬𝐽𝐫𝐞 who transport our crew to an abstract landscape that resembles Tombstone, Arizona. The entire town thinks the Enterprise crew are the 𝐾lantons and the 𝐾laughries, with 𝐶hekhov being Billy Claiborne. And in this town, they must face off against Wyatt Earp, Virgil, Morgan, and Doc Holliday. As a child, this episode was my first introduction to Wyatt Earp and the gunfight at the OK Corral, which would eventually become an adult obsession of mine, mostly through my love of the movie Tombstone. So Star Trek is officially canceled at the end of the 3rd season, with only 79 episodes, despite a furious letter-writing campaign. Everyone associated with Star Trek went their separate ways and assumed that their time with Star Trek was officially over. However, something quite unexpected and miraculous happened. Paramount Pictures wanted to make money with Star Trek by selling syndication rights to individual television broadcasting companies. One of the companies to pick this up was Kaiser Broadcasting, which was broadcasting on the UHF frequencies. The CEO of Kaiser Broadcasting was a huge fan of Star Trek, and he began airing the Star Trek episodes at the cushy time slot of 6 p.m. as counter-programming to network news. It was brilliant, and Kaiser Broadcasting had a hit with Star Trek. Soon, other broadcasting companies followed suit and purchased syndication rights from Paramount. By 1971, Star Trek was playing all across the country. Star Trek reruns were very popular, and millions of new fans who never saw Star Trek in its original run became huge fans through these reruns. On January 21, 1972, the world saw the rise of the first official Star Trek convention. It was held at the Statler Convention Center in New York City, where over 3,000 fans met to talk about Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry, his wife Majel Barrett, were guests along with series writer D.C. Fontana. Soon, Star Trek conventions began to pop up everywhere in every city. Star Trek was back and better than ever. In only a few years, we would see a Star Trek the Motion Picture, followed by Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan, and eventually the golden age of the Star Trek franchise. But that is another story.